So welcome everyone to the second workshop where today we're going to talk about HTML and CSS. We're going to talk a little bit about what HTML is and what CSS is, and then eventually hand code some HTML and some Wake CSS and see how it goes. So first, what is HTML? So I talked about it last time. It's hypertext markup language, and what it looks like is tags or something called elements where you have an HTML element and you close it. So if you're familiar with XML, you should know like this kind of a way of writing into an element and then closing it. So what HTML is it derives from XML and it has something called DTD, which is defined in its doc type. So you don't need to know very detailed about what DTD does or what doc type is, because in HTML5, the doc type has been simplified to simply writing doc type HTML. Before, it used to be like 2 lines of very long string which pointed to a website, which gave out the DTD of the web page. So what DTD does is defines the structure and the format of tags you can use on a page. So in an XML file, DTD will be the first thing you define, which will define what attributes or tags you can use. So the reason XML has that, because XML, you can put any kind of tag. So companies or people providing APIs put that DTD, which defines the structure, so people do not send out fake information or wrong information over XML. So that's more of a security layer added to XML. So that is what HTML is derived from. And if you look up XHTML or DHTML, you'll find different versions of HTML, and the only difference is defining how the DTD works. So I'm talking about HTML. Let's talk what CSS is. So before the invention of CSS, everything was styled inside the HTML. There was nothing called an external file for styling it. This became very bad in terms of when files became big, like when you have web pages that are becoming big. For example, Yahoo is one of like the oldest companies which was making websites. Now, the way Yahoo used to work before CSS came out is that if there's a web page that they need to update, they'll have literally a team of programmers, like in terms of 50 or 60, who are doing pure HTML, and they have to manually update the code. And let's say you have a web page right here, and there's like a sidebar which is red color, right? So your manager says that, oh, I want you to change that red color to blue on all the pages I have. So before CSS, everyone had to go manually into all these pages and change that code from making it red to blue. It was like a very long process, and it would take like days or months to change that. So that's when something called CSS came out, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, which is they define the style of your web page. And for example here, if you want, you define red in the sidebar as a CSS property in a different file, or you can either do it inside the HTML, which is not recommended, but you will find some websites which do that. They are normally generated sites, they're not hand-coded. But apart from that, if you want to now change that, you can just change the color property to blue, and it will change across all your web pages. So by that being said, we'll start coding HTML and see how its structures like. But before we do that, I think I want to talk about something very important, which not many people think it is important, but I think that's the most important tool of your development kit, is talking about which editor you would like to use. So this is important because the editor you use defines how proficient or how fast you write your code. So if you choose the editor which you like, it could be like a simple text editor like Notepad++, or something like a big IDE like Eclipse. It's really depending on your choice and how your editor treats you. There's numerous editors. I personally prefer something called Sublime Text, which is available for Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's free to use for unlimited time, but it's not a free software. You get a free unlimited trial. So I really like it because you can add more packages to it. So what packages does is I can add different packages for linting my code. What linting is, like checking for errors and stuff like that. So I have packages installed for linting JavaScript, linting PHP, linting CSS, and stuff like that. I have plugins for connecting it to external server itself. So there's something called SFTP, which is a secure file transfer protocol. So I have that all inbuilt. So I really like that. I really like how I can code with the way it indents stuff for me because I am really indent free. Yes, you can use Notepad++, but that's like very base. Yeah, I mean, some people love it. I tried it. I didn't really like it because I prefer my code to be highlighted. So that's something text editors offer. But you can use like Eclipse too. There's some people, some companies, I would rather say, use Eclipse as their development tool. So yeah, you can use Eclipse. I prefer Sublime Text. There's one called Atom.io, which has recently came out by GitHub. That's free for students if you want to try that. It's also open source. It looks really nice. It's based on how Sublime Text is. But the only problem I have with Atom is the way it indents my code. It doesn't. I'm used to the way Sublime Text indents it, and Atom doesn't do it that way, so it's really annoying for me. So it kind of slows me down, so I don't use it. That being said, let's get started to write some HTML. So the first thing is, let's go to terminal. Or you don't have to go to terminal for this. I just want to create a new file. I prefer terminal. So I'm going to go to my web dev directory, which is in documents, college, and somewhere here, web dev workshop, yeah. I'm gonna make a new folder called code. I'm gonna go in it, and I'm gonna make one more folder called 01 for first code. Go inside it. You don't have to do the structures the same way I did. You can make it any way you want it. So the first thing is we're gonna talk about how HTML works. So I'm gonna create a new file. Again, the command for creating a new file on terminal is touch. It's called touch and the file name, which in this case we'll put index.html. I explained why index.html is the name last time, but I'm still gonna talk about it again. Is because most servers are configured to open this file first when it's put on. Like for example, Apache by default, it's configured to open index.html. As that being said, this can be changed in server configurations, but not many people do it. So it's like a tradition on how you name the file. So you create a file called touch.index.html. So another thing I want to say is that if you want to use Vim or Y with as a text editor, what you would do is write vim index.html. This will also create a new file and will directly take you to it, and then you can start writing your code. So if anyone who enjoys Y could use that. I don't really am very fond of Y. I prefer Sublime Text more, so I'm gonna do that. So creating my index file, and if you see, that's my file, and I can open in Sublime Text. I have command line tools installed on my Mac for Sublime Text, so I can just type in Sublime and index.html. It will open that file. And there's one more command called Sublime dot, which will open that folder in Sublime Text. So right now, I can see that that's my folder. So in future, if I make new files, I have all the file listed. This is going to be like a project folder. So in that index file. So the first line of code in any HTML page is the doc type. You define that. So to type doc type, you type doc type HTML. This is how you type doc type in HTML5. The previous versions of HTML had a different doc type. You don't have to worry about it, but you should know about it. So if you Google doc type HTML4, we can see what it looked like, and you'd be happy that they did that. Let's see if they have that on W3 Schools. Yeah, so this is the doc type for HTML 4.01 strict, and this is for traditional. So imagine writing this down every time you make an HTML page. Yay to the guys who made HTML5 doc type. So now, once you write a doc type, you start your HTML tags. So everything you code will be inside your HTML tags. So you open the tag like this, and you close it. So anything after that will be ignored. So inside the HTML tags, so let me say one thing here. The correct name for the tags is not tags, it's element. It's called HTML element, but people use tags as slang, and it's just being used very often that a lot of people don't really know the real name of it. So I just want to let you guys know that the real name is element. If someone asks you, you should say it's element, not tag. So after that, you open the head tag. So what the head tag is, your head, which you don't see it in your code. It does not render to the page, but this has details about your title, your metadata, and links to your CSS. So let's first start by writing the title. So I want to name it my first page, and I close the title. So this is the title which appears on the top of the web browser. So like right here, you see new tab. I guess like I go to a website and gives you a better idea. Like right here, Google. This is the title on Google's page. They put it there. So that's the title which will appear on your page. The other thing which is there is called meta description, which is used for search engines. We'll go a little bit into meta description later after discovering more tags with HTML, but for now, we'll do simple HTML, then add CSS to it. So after defining a title tag, we go down outside the head tag, and you make a tag called body. So this is the tag where all your stuff is rendered to the page. So anything you write here, this is a test, will be rendered to the page. So after I save it, I can open up in a browser. This is a test. Yeah, it works. So this is what renders in the page. But the way I wrote it right now, it's just, so yeah, this is not how you write your text though. So I'm just showing you, demonstrating you. So though in the body tag, there's different attributes or tags you can use. So the most famous tag you might have come across is the P tag, which stands for the paragraph tag. This is where you can put like a long description here. I'm just going to put lorem ipsum, which is just random placeholder text. So this is the paragraph tag. So now if you go back, you see how the way it's rendered has a different format to it. And so this is the paragraph tag, which you'll use quite often. The other tag which is very commonly used is the H1 tag, which stands for heading 1. So there's different numbers of heading. There's 6 different heading tags you can use, and they all have different size and styles to it. So if we do heading 1 and close that tag, you can see it's going to render a big heading. So you can actually do that for a bunch of them. Heading 2, and let's see how it's different. So you can have it till heading 6. I'm not going to do it all the way because why should I do that? Heading 6 is going to be smaller because it progresses how the number goes by. So at this point, does anyone have any questions which they have? Yes, no? All right, so I'm going to continue on. So after the heading, we're going to talk about something called span tag. So what span does is it selects an item from either a paragraph or a div. I'm going to talk about div is later, but it doesn't do anything with it. It doesn't have any properties attached to it. So what it can be useful is for selecting something and then styling the specific word. For example, I can select this word right here and then give it different styles. I'm going to show you how to use style in a few minutes, but just bear with me that the span tag is only for selecting. It doesn't have any style or properties attached to it. So another very important tag is the div tag, and it is accompanied by either an ID or a class. So what is an ID or a class is a selector. So let's first create a div with an ID. So to define a div ID, you do div an ID and you put your ID name. So I put ID1 and then close that tag. So ID1 is the ID of this div tag, which can be used as selector when you're using CSS. There's something called div class, which is, well, div doesn't have a class. The ID and a class can be defined to any element. Okay, so you can define a class here, calling class 1. So what divs, IDs and class does is for selecting when you want to style specific elements. So when I use a span tag here, I would either give it an ID of like style red, which tells me that, oh, this is my ID which style red. So I can select it in my CSS to manipulate it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So this ID or class can be used in any tag. It can be used here, or even in the HTML, you can have an ID or a class. So after that, we're gonna talk about image. So obviously a web page needs an image. So to define an image, we do image tag, and you type in src, which stands for the source. Put it equals, and in quotes you put the source of the image. So you don't have to close the image tag. So the way to close the image tag is this way, where you close it in line. So you don't have to close it. So let's get some image and put it in here. So let's go to images.google.com and get some image. You're gonna get this image. We copy the link, come back here and paste it. So now we save it and then go back to our page and see how it appears. So yay, we got our image. So after the image, there's obviously links on your web page. So a link is defined as a tag, and it has something called href, which is the location where you point it to. And you have to close the a tag. So every day, any text you enter here will be the link. So this could be either pointing to google.com. So now when you go to your web page, it's hidden by the image, so I'm gonna comment it. And that talks me about how do you comment in HTML. To comment in HTML, you start with the exclamation mark with 2 dashes and then close it with 2 dashes and less than sign or greater than sign. So if you want to comment code in here, you put it in this. So this is commented out, and this is our link tag which goes to google.com. So the thing you have to understand is an HTML tag element or tag will have attributes to attach to it, either by default, or if you in future, if you use some frameworks, you can use your custom attributes. So an attribute is defined by the name of the attribute equals to, and in quotes, the attribute property. So for example, let's make a div here with a class called class1 or class2, and I also want to give this div an ID, so I put space and I can define an ID as well. So the ID2. So this are called attributes in the HTML. So I think one last thing we're going to talk about before diving into styling the page is lists and tables. So what a list is, there's 2 different kinds of lists in HTML. There's ordered list and there's unordered list. So the difference between unordered and ordered is that orders are either numbers, so by default they appear as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and unordered appears as bullets. So let's first create an unordered list, which is the tag is UL, and you close the UL tag, and inside the UL tag you create something called LI, which stands for list item, which holds each of individual list items. So something you should notice how I indent my code. It's really important that you get in the style of indenting it a similar way, because when you get to like big chunks of HTML code, and if it's in all one line, it's going to be very difficult for you to read once you get back to it on like a week or two later. So in the list item, I can put like item 1 and see what it renders out. And you can see it's rendering out item 1 with a bullet. So I can define multiple items here. So it'll come out as bullets. So with an ordered list, you get numbers. So you do the same syntax in terms of how it indents and how you put the list items, but you, instead of calling UL, you call it OL, which stands for ordered list, and you still put the list item as the item 1 and item 2. And if you go back to Chrome, and then we see the difference that how it's rendering bullets, whereas this case it's rendering numbers. So you can change the bullets and the numbers by providing it styles, which we will do later when we talk about styles. But before jumping into styles, let's talk about tables. So tables have been really important part of HTML in earlier years. So before styling or cascading style sheet existed, or while it also existed, everything was styled using tables. So all your layouts were given using tables. It was a very vigorous process, and like it was, if you understand how you do it, you could do it, or else you'll be struggling with how would you nest this item inside it. But that's the major way it used to be done in like early 1990s or 2000s. It's still done on some websites because the golden rule of computing is if it ain't broken, don't fix it. So if it works, companies don't tend to fix it. So to define table, you do like table tag, you close the table tag, and you should, as you know, in a table there's rows and there's columns. So to define a row, you type in TR, which stands for table rows. And inside the row, when you want to put some data in it, you put TD, which stands for table data, and you can put data 1, and you close that. So now when you display it, let's see how it looks. And we have, so just so you know how it looks, I'm going to add some border to it so you can figure out how it looks. If the code confuses you, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it later. So you see how it's just one block. So let's add more stuff to it and see how it looks. So see how it's in one row, it's in different rows and it's providing data. So if you want to add more data to it, you can do TD data 5. And you can similarly copy that around everywhere. And you can see how it appears. And if you want borders here, that's all by styling. We'll do that later, but not right now. So there's different ways to define headers in tables as well. So there's a tag called thead, which stands for table heading, and you open it and close it, and inside there you define your table rows again, and you close that, and you can define your table heading here, which is in the table heading tag called th. And if you do heading 1, and you can do heading 2, and if you see it, it's gonna appear right here. So when you do that, all your rest of your code is gonna, by default, if you look at the source code of it, it's gonna be in something called tbody, which stands for the table body. So most people don't put it in, but the browsers interpret it and put it by itself to make it neater. I think you should learn how it put in, because if you're using extensive tables, you'll need to know how table heading is different from table body. So now if you see, it's not going to change anything because the browsers by default put that in. So that's all about the tables for now. We'll go I don't know if you want to do a table layout because no one uses that anymore. So the only reason you'll use table is to actually use for table generated data. I think we'll work on more on table generated data later on, but let's talk about styling right now. So so you can see I styled this table by typing style attribute, and inside that I did like some crazy stuff right here. So let's not jump into that deep detail. Let's start with the basic. So if you want to do something called inline styling, which is you define the style to the element itself, you can type it as an attribute, and you, as like all attributes, you put it this way, and you can, so let's define the color for this paragraph tag. So to define color, you type in color, and you put colon, and you type the color name. So the color name could be hexadecimal or actual names, or it could be RGB or RGBA. So there's different formats it accepts. I think that's all I know on top of my head. I don't know if there's any other format it accepts. So if you're using more than one styling, you put a semicolon to break it. So I can also define a font size, which stands for how much size do I have for the font, and I can define it to be 14 pixels. So the sizes are going to be in terms of pixels in this case, or mostly in any HTML. You can define in terms of M, which is like, I think 1/4 of the character M. And once you save it, you can see it's going to be red, and it's 14 pixels. So anyone see it? So going back here, let's style this guy to red again, because, well, we already did red, so let's change this to blue and style here to red. So you'll see that how I can style one word using the span tag, and it didn't style it. Oh, because I'm stupid. I didn't define the color right here. And there you go. It's red inside blue. So this syntax is the same syntax which is used in CSS. So let's create our first CSS file. So before we create our CSS file, we have to link the CSS file to the HTML file. So to do that, we use something called link tag, which is link. You type in rel, which is an attribute, and you say style sheet, and you type the type of this link to be text, CSS, and you type in href, which is where it is located. And here we're going to call it style.css, and you close that. You don't need to close the link tag with another link tag, you just close it in line. So once defining that, we'll save it, and we'll create a new file called style.css. So I do file, a new file, call it style.css, and this is our CSS file. And inside here, the first thing we're gonna do is give a background color. So the background color is normally given to the body if you want to give it to the whole web page. So to select an element from HTML, you type the element name. So for in this case, I'm going to select the body element. So I type in body. You open and close curly braces, and inside those curly braces, you can define background color. And I can make it, let's say, brown. And this makes it the body's background color to be brown. If I refresh the page, this is going to be brown. It's not the best color to choose, but I think it would be okay for demonstration purposes. So I think the main thing I want to point out is difference between different CSS tags which are available to you. There's a lot of CSS tags, and you won't have to remember them all because you can always look at the documentation. But once you start using CSS a lot, you kind of get used to the major ones. So I'm going to talk about the major ones, and then you can look up if there's anything you don't know and how to want to do it. So the first thing is background color, which sets the background color of that element. The second thing is color. So this is different from background color as it only sets color of the text. So in this case, I can make the back color white, and if you see the text now, it's all going to be white. So So here's the thing, why is the text here not white? So that's because how the nature of CSS works. So I define the body elements to a special style, but I'm going deeper into the code and I'm defining each element in its own style. So let's remove all of our styles from inline and put it into the CSS file. And I remove the style as well. And I think, yeah, right here. And I think that's about it. So let's go back to the CSS. Now, once you define the background color, the color, so there's something called border. So border is something around the item you make or the element you make. So by default, the border difference on different element. So in case of body, it's gonna be 0, and it's not gonna have any color or any style of the way it borders. So let's define a border in the body. We're gonna make it 2 pixels. We're gonna make it solid. So there's different ways you can have a border. You can have like either a solid border or a dotted or a dash. There's different styles. You can look it up in the documentation. So in this case, we're gonna define how much size the body is, a style of the border, and the last thing you define is the color of the border. So in this case, we're gonna make it black. So I hope it's visible, and you can see that we have a border now which is black. So once done that, we're gonna get into something called margin and padding. So if you're never familiar with how web pages padding and margin works, this is gonna be a little bit confusing at first, but just bear with me. I'm gonna show you a very simple example and how it works. So what we're gonna do is define margin. So when you define a margin in this way and type in, let's say, 5 pixels, it's gonna take an account of top, right, left, top, right, bottom, and left. So if you want to define different margins for different places, this is going to be for top, I'm going to have 5 pixels. For the right side, I'm going to have 2 pixels. From the bottom, I'm going to still have 5 pixels. And for the left, I'm going to have 2 pixels. So this clockwise pattern is similar to anything which uses this way. So when we do padding, this is going to be similar. So let's save this and see what changes right here. So pay attention to the text right here and see how it changes. See how it like spreads out across? So let's contrast that to the padding, and then go deeper into what's the major difference in padding and margin. So we're gonna define padding of 5 pixel all around. So when you do 1, it's gonna do all around. So other thing you could do is you can define it this way, which 5 pixel or 2 pixel, which means I want the top and the bottom to be 5 pixels, and I want the left and right to be 2 pixels. So, but for in this case, we're gonna do 5 pixels. So let's see how this changes. So you see how like the text is condensing? So let's use something called Chrome Developer Tools. So if you're not using Google Chrome, or if you're using Internet Explorer, please stop and go to either Chrome or like Safari or Firefox, because they have like great developer tools. And in most cases, you'll be able to do something like inspect element in most browsers. But if you're in Chrome, you have something called inspect element. So you see, let's go, and you can go over like each element and select, and it shows like different properties of it, and it's really helpful. So let's minimize all this. Let's go back to the body, and let's see what the body is doing. I'm gonna make it split it, and split right here. So the body, right? So you see there's something like which is a brownish color, and there's something green color. So like, what's the difference? If you go on side here, so this is the margin, which is outside the element, and the padding is inside the element. So the spacing, which is inside the element, is for padding, and the spacing, which is for outside the element, is for margin. And the thing in the between margin and padding is what called the border. So So if you look at it, we define 5 pixel margin with 2 pixel and 5 pixel and 2 pixel, and we define 5 pixel padding. So I think a better example to do this is by using a different element, and we're gonna do it live and see what changes right here. So I'm gonna select the H1 tag, and I'm able to change the margin right here in Chrome Developer Tools. So I can either double click here and change the values, or I can find where it says in here and change the values from here. So H1, I don't see anything here, so I'm gonna go right here and I'm gonna change its margin to 0. See how it changes. Now, since there's no margin, every text from top and bottom kind of come closer to each other. But let's define a padding and see what happens. So let's give a padding on top of 10 and the bottom 10. So see how it's like spacing out? It's kind of telling, okay, anything inside the border, I want some space with my own. Everything outside, I don't care, push it out. So the idea of margin and padding kind of confuses a lot of people, and I think you get more used to it once you start working on projects and start making stuff, because that's the best way to learn, is by make stuff. If you don't know how to do it, look it up. You'll somehow figure it out. So once we talk about margin and padding, we're going to talk about like more selectors and how do you select an ID or a class. So if you remember, we define an ID right here, ID1 and class 1. So let's first take the ID1, define it a height and a width, and define a background color and see what happens, right? So to select an ID, you use something called hashtag or pound, and you type the ID name in. So ID1. So this is selecting ID. And you still use the curly braces open and close. And here, let's define a height and a width. So to define the width, you simply type width and you define in terms of pixels or percentage. We're going to talk about percentage later when we do responsive design, so don't worry about it right now. So in terms of pixels, let's define a width and a height at 100 pixels. So when we do this, and when you go back and refresh it, you see like a space created out, but there's nothing in it. But when we then define the height, so like when I comment this part out, and to comment in the CSS, you use something like this, where you /* and close it with **. It's block coding. That's how styling, block commenting, that's how styling in CSS is done. So when you comment that out, you see the space is gone. Why does that happen? Because by default, div doesn't take up any space or height or width. It's literally nothing unless you define any properties to it or unless you put any text in it. So for example, if I go back to the next page and put test here and refresh it, I see test. So I can literally put like a bunch of stuff in here and the height is going to be flexible in that terms. But I can define its height or width to be fixed. So let's uncomment this code out and we define the width and the height. Now let's define a background color. And what color do we want to make it? I don't know, white maybe? So we make it white. Go back here and see there's a 100 pixel by 100 pixel block of like a square which is white. So in background color, you use something called hexadecimal colors. So they look like it starts with a hashtag and has like a bunch of 6-digit characters. You don't have to remember what each color stands for. I don't either. If you don't know the hexadecimal, there's like a bunch of websites where you can like Google it. HTML. If you search HTML color hexadecimals, you come to like a color picker like this. And see, you can pick like whatever color you want and this will generate the color code. You can copy it, come back to Sublime Text and paste it in. And when you go back to your page, refresh it, it's going to be that color. You can also define RGB, which is going to be like this. You can define the number of red, green, and blue. Let's see, I don't know what color that is, but yeah, that's that color. Or you can define RGBA, which stands for opacity, and the last parameter here is going to be how much opacity you want to give it. So it's going to be, see, you can, it's a little bit lighter, and you can see the red in the background. I can make a little bit more, and you can see it's a little bit lighter now, and I can see more of the red. So that's in terms of coloring it. So let's see, what's the next tag we want to talk about is links. We're going to select a link called A, and so by default you look at a link, it's going to have like an underline and it's blue. So you can change to have no underlines. If you recently looked at Google, it used to underline all this link, but now it doesn't. It's all different color. It's like all blue colored, but it has no underline. So we're gonna remove the underline now. So to do that, you type in text, decoration, and you type in none. So if you refresh the page, you see the underline's gone. And let's define a color which we can see. So let's make it white because I feel that I can see that color very well. So now you can see that it doesn't have any underline, but it's still a link. As I said, I can define the font size to be like 18 pixels. So I can also define something called font family. So what this is, like, I can define a bunch of fonts which I want to use on my website. So I can define like Arial. I can define, so the Arial will be the first font it will use, and it will go through your browser and see if you have that font installed. If not, I can define a backup font for Verdana, which is say like if you don't have Arial, use this. So you can see like how it changes to Arial. So let's go get back our picture, right? So let's uncomment this code, and let's put it in the back, last item. So we have our picture, but this picture is huge. I don't want it this big. So what I can do is I'm gonna set a specific height and width for the image. So I'm gonna say width to be, I don't know, let's say like 500 pixels, and I feel the height's about 300 pixels. And let's see, I think it's gonna look weird, but let's see. So you see how now it's smaller? So you can define image height and size, and obviously you can define it a background, a border, like color, different styles of border. So here's the thing, right? So let's say I have two different images here, but I want to keep one of the images smaller and one of them bigger. So how would I do that? Like if I do it in this way, it's going to make both of them smaller. If you look right here, it's going to make both of them smaller. I don't want that. I want one to be its original size and one to be smaller. So how would I go about doing that? So that's when your IDs and classes will come useful. So I can define this image to have an ID of sized image. And, and this one is just going to be image. And I go back to my CSS, and instead of selecting my image, I'm going to select my ID called sized image. I think I spelled it right. Yeah. So now if you go back here and see, one is original size and one is smaller. So that's when your IDs and classes are going to come useful. So now you would ask me, what's the difference between an ID and a class? So an ID is a property defined to one element. So I cannot use this ID on this image right here, and it will not work because IDs are only for defining styles to one element. So if you want to define styles to multiple elements, you use classes, because the properties of classes are carried over to as number of elements as you want, and IDs are for like a unique item you'll have. So normally when you make a web page, you will put everything inside a div, either call a wrapper or a container, and you'll define the wrapper or the container in an ID. not a class. You could do it in a class, but normally you would do it in ID because that's the only thing which has its unique properties, and that's gonna be carrying everything inside it. So I think after doing that, we're gonna talk about CSS box model properties. So like, this is okay, I can make HTML, but like, how do I make web pages look like web pages, like something like this? So that is all the power of CSS. So let's make a new HTML. We'll call it 01.html. And so I have snippets in my code, which that means I don't have to write it down every time I start a new HTML page. So I have a snippet for HTML5, which has basic HTML layout. And I can type in my title, box model. And so before I continue doing that, let's first like kind of in a memory draw our web page and see what it will look like. So a normal web page right here. So let's say this is your browser, and how would you have your normal web page look in? So you normally have something like a header which has all your branding information, your logos, things. Then you have something called a navbar where your home, your other navigation is. Then you have either like text here which has like either a picture and then like bunch of text here. You have like some sidebar with either images or ads or stuff like that. And then you have one more block of text or like picture, and you have like bunch of text. And at the bottom, you have a footer which has like your copyright information or your links to your social accounts and something like that. So does that look familiar, right? It's like a very general web page. So how does it come from like random text on the web page to something like this? So let's try to make something like this. We're not going to worry about navbar at this point. We're going to do it in some time. So let's just make the whole box model, that's why it's called CSS box model properties. So as I said, you define everything in something called a container or wrapper. So let's make your container, and I'm going to give it an ID of container. All right. So just a note right here, I have something called a plugin install called Emmet, which lets me type HTML faster without like actually typing it. I can put snippets of code. I will generate HTML from it. I might use that because I'm used to doing that. So if I do that, call me out on that and I'll actually write the HTML. So inside the container, let's define your header. So we're going to give it an ID header. Right, so in the header, we're going to put some text called branding. Then we have our navbar. So here's the thing, HTML5 brings a feature called header tag and the navbar tag. We're not going to use it at this point because IE8 doesn't support HTML5 features. So we're going to think that our target at this point is IE8, and we're going to use like divs. We'll do HTML5 style later. So let's just make this with divs. So we're going to make ID navbar and close that. Right, so here, normally your navbar is made of unordered list where you have different section of your web page as a list, and then you use some CSS styling to get it work. So for now, I'm just gonna put an unordered list with random items. And this is the plugin I was talking about called Emmet, where I can just type in like snippets of code and it'll generate this code for me. It's like so much faster for writing HTML. So I have home, menu, and let's say contact. Right? So after that, then you have your body. So this one, I'm going to give it a class, because we have two components which look similar to each other, so it's kind of thought that they're going to share most of the properties in terms of styling. So I'm going to call it the body content, and I'm gonna close it. Then I have my sidebar, which I'm gonna give it an ID of sidebar. And keep in mind, like, you can switch around IDs with classes, but you cannot always switch around classes with IDs. So if you think like you want to type a class of container, feel free to do that. It won't make much difference. So we'll have our sidebar where I'm gonna put sidebar. And in our body content, let's go back to it and let's put random text in it. So when you're testing your program or when it's in development, you don't put actual text in it. So you put something called placeholder text or lorem ipsum. I don't know if anyone knows about it, but it's just some Greek letter random text which you can use. Google lorem ipsum. There's like lorem ipsum generators, and you can like copy the text. This is more for placeholders. I have obviously a plugin to do that. I can type in lipsum and I put star, and I can put in how many numbers of item I want. So I can say I want 4 of them, so it'll generate 4 of lorem ipsum for me. And the last thing we'll have is our footer. And we put footer. So let's see how it looks like. So we go back here, and we're going to change the index to be 01.html. So, okay, this has a bunch of text in it, but it does not look to me like a web page. So how do we do that? So we use CSS for it to style it and the way it looks. So we're going to create a new CSS file called 01.css. So you might see a lot of people put CSS inside HTML, and you can do that using the style tag in the head, and you can do it there. And you can actually put all your CSS here, like body, color, and like thread. See, this is not wrong. People don't prefer to do it this way because when you get to large-scale applications, where you have like files and files of styling you need to do, you'll have like a very long HTML page, and it's going to be very hard to read. That's why you have that in your different files, so it's easy to maintain code. So like a link tag with the rel, style sheet, and href pointing to 01.css. So once that's done, let's give a body a color. I mean background color. So let's give it background color. I don't know what color you want to give. Let's go look at it and see. Say like a light yellow color maybe. Okay, that's not bad. So now what I want you guys to do is I want you guys to select the container, and I want you to give it a height and a width. Actually, I just want to give it a width, right? So what I want you to do is I want you to take the container, and I want you to give it a width of 960 pixels. So I want you guys to do that. So you saw how so now if you give your divs a background color, you can see how it changes, like, right? And you can see the difference, like you have your body color differently, but you have this small div which is like a red color or any color you define. So let me catch up to you guys by defining container. I'm gonna give it a background color of red. I'm gonna give it a width of 960 pixels. Let's see how it looks. So you see how it looks? Like, why is it on the side? Like, obviously you don't want it to be on the side. I want it to be in the center. So there's the trick to center any element in your web page is to use something for margins. So you can do like margin left auto and margin right auto. So what this will do, it will center your element on the web page. So if you look at right here, now it's centered, right? So let's dive in more deeper into this and like separate each elements into different colors. So first, let me just call the elements itself and define them colors, and then later on we'll go back, back in, and give them specific heights. So let's give header a background color of I don't know, green. You can see why I don't design because I pick like very bad colors. Then I'm gonna give my nav bar a color of so hard to pick colors. Brown maybe? Okay, I can see the difference. Alright. Then we have our body content. So I'm gonna take my body content class and I'm gonna define a background color of black. And I'm also gonna change the color, which is the color of the text, to white so we can read the text. And yeah, I'm gonna close it with a semicolon so you can see how it's different. So for our sidebar, gonna use the sidebar ID and give it a background color of blue. Okay, so it's different. And finally, we're gonna take our footer and we're gonna give that background color of violet. So okay, so we can tell a difference. So now once we have everything different color coded, let's go back to each item, give it specific height and width. So look back to the picture and you see like your branding or your header is across the whole page and it looks about like 80 pixels to me. So I go back to my header, and since it's going to be the whole page, I don't need to define a width for it because by default it's going to cover everything, and I can give it a height of 80 pixels. So let's see. So now you can see it's covering your whole container and it has the height. So after the header, we have the nav bar. So for now, we're just gonna take the nav bar, give it let's say height of 50 pixels. See how that looks. The nav bar is gonna look funky because we have list items in it, which are longer than the 50 pixels. But we'll come back to the nav bar. So we go back to the body content, and looks like the body content is pretty much taken about 700 pixels of it. So I would say I give it a height of 700 pixels. Right? So what you notice is that it's split into almost 70-30%, where 70% is like your content and the other 30% is your text. So we got to divide the width properly in terms of how we gonna specify it, right? So you can do it this way, which is where you can define the width to be about like 70% and the sidebar width to be 30%. So this will take the page and take that much percent of pixels off it, and that will set that height. So why are percentage useful when you're using CSS? So when you're using a mobile device where the resolution is different from a computer, what CSS does for you, it does the math that, okay, I'm going to take 70% of my width and then take it that way. So let's first define the width. And I define the height of the footer to be 50 pixels. I'm going to do a float, which is, it will float the element to either a left, right, or center. For in this case, we're going to do this float left. Going to just do this float left. And going to do clear on both, which means clear everything right here. So let's see. Looks about right. We forgot to define the height of the sidebar, which is going to be 700 pixels as well. So now it looks something like a web page. Obviously, it looks ugly as hell, but looks has the layout of it. If you didn't understand the last part of it, I'm gonna cover more in the next part, next week possibly.